Speaking to his disciples in Matthew 9, Jesus said, "No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch will pull away from the garment, making the tear worse. Neither do people pour new wine into old wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst, the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved."
I'd like to welcome you back to The Journey Back. This is our third episode, and we just listened to that passage out of Matthew 9 that talks about the old and the new wineskin and the difference between the two. And, I love that passage, and I don't know if you remember or not, but it was probably about 30 years ago. It was shortly after we had planted the Boise Vineyard. You and I did this team teaching one time to a group of students that had come up to, participate in the church plant that we had just started. We were probably less than a year old at that time. And you and I did this team teaching session where we taught this very passage. And so when you sent this passage over to me this week, I thought that is really somewhat profound to me, just because you and I started out early in our ministry, early in my ministry. And, you were already 10 years or so in to the ministry itself, with this passage. And at that time, we were just starting this very church plant in Boise, which was a new wineskin for the Boise area. Mm-hmm. And for those of you who might have been part of that church plant or ever visited us, in the Boise area, it was super, unusual for a church such as ours to come in and have tables and chairs and, have a coffee bar. And I know that's pretty common today, maybe not the tables and chairs, but the coffee bar and just a new way of doing church. And I remember the, community was very conservative at that time. And I remember, you and I would even go to, those pastor meetings where they would have the city pastors come together. And I just remember this feeling like they were looking down on us, like, yeah, this won't last. You guys are the new boys in town and, you're a fly by night. And it ended up being a new wineskin that really flourished for years, for 30 years. And so I just thought it was profound that we started with that passage. It's one of my favorite passages, but it's a challenge for us as Christians because we're always having to fight back that temptation to fall into comfort zones.
Yeah, and the thing is we had experienced it previously in Southern California at the Lancaster Vineyard, that excitement of just being involved in something fresh and new, and it definitely was a new wineskin in those days. Because the Lancaster Vineyard modeled that for us, that just our old pastor, Brent Rue, he's a very innovative, creative guy. And he just let's just do it different, and it really, it didn't attract the older crowd, but it attracted a younger crowd. And all of us in those days, Nancy and I, we were kids, we were kids raising kids, and it was just it was there was a lot of disorganization almost in it, but it was exciting. And the word that always came to me was synergy, and it was like this auxiliary. In those days, in the days of this was after that, but in the 60s, we had this word it was a happening, like right. Woodstock, like it was a happening, like there's something you couldn't make happen. It just happened, and man, to be caught up in the swirl of that life. And I always said, life begets life. When there's life, it attracts more life. And it's usually younger people initially in those new moves. Of course, then we all grow old, in the process. But it's so exciting and exhilarating. And it kind of spawns this passion in people's hearts and just say, I want to give everything to this. And then we had the same experience in Boise, and it was, man, you just pray for those days, and long for those days if you've ever experienced it personally.
And, I had come out of the Catholic Church. I grew up in the Catholic Church. I went to Catholic school. I was an altar boy. And so my whole life had been steeped in tradition and reverence and the stained glass windows. And then all of a sudden I was part of the vineyard, and it was a totally new thing. And for me as a young teenager, I was able to throw off all of the encumbrances of, what I saw at that time as religiosity. And I was free.
Yeah.
I felt like I was free to pursue the Lord. And I felt like our church was an expression of relationship with God, which was new and was unencumbered. And I feel like that's exciting for a lot of young people, at least. When this kind of a happening happens, people feel this unencumbered way, but it's also a struggle for older, believers or people that have, are in older established denominations to accept. And I remember that we were part of the charismatic Catholic Church at that time. And when we moved over, a lot of my parents' friends, to go to something like the Vineyard was just a bridge too far. It was just too far for them in terms of its level of excitement and lack of tradition.
There's some characteristics of an awakening, and that kind of synergistic event that happens. Because generally it looks so different than the traditional system or the previous system or move of God. My family had come out of Methodism, which of course was part of the Great Awakening, my grandfather was, and my great-grandfather was a circuit preacher. His actual name was John Wesley Robinson, and he'd go town to town. He'd go into these old towns and take over the honky-tonk piano in the saloon and pound out gospel hymns. And that was that was the new wineskin of that day, And the thing is what happens historically is that the old system will always persecute the new system. It'll always push back on the new system because it'll look so wrong to them. It'll feel so wrong to them. And of course, we're always waiting and looking for this spark of the Spirit in a new generation to see this happen. And I don't want to be the guy that pushes back on it if I can help it. But I've had some experiences already where I've realized I probably might be, and would. So it's something we've got to be aware of.
Yeah, and you wrote that book, Reform. How many years ago did you write that? In 2015?
2015. It was I actually wrote it in the fall before the Trump administration inauguration. So it was written before, kind of all the politics and stuff and everything that kind of started cluttering up the church happened. So,
and I remember, your book talked about this, and we were feeling like, and after I read your book, I felt like at that time we felt the ground shaking beneath us. And then we've had this last 5 years really as the church has really gotten divided over politics. And now we feel like the church is gone from, moving into irrelevancy to very irrelevant to a lot of people. And so we're now, 5 years down the road at a place that I totally did not expect that the church would end up in this disarray that it's in now.
And not only that, but who could have guessed in 2015 that 2020 would look like it did?
Right.
And I like
no one saw it coming.
Yeah. I in the book, I talked about the 2020s being a distinctive in history, especially church history, but in history, like the Roaring 20s had been in the 1920s. And I also had said that the 2020s will be the 60s on steroids. It's going to be all the same issues of social, racial injustice, of environmental crisis, of the drug culture. What was kind of marijuana and some psychedelic drugs became this massive opioid crisis. Everything was kind of the same issues, but now just magnified 100 times. And that in the midst of that, out of that crisis would come a spiritual awakening. So that was kind of the thesis of the book.
Now, you have this word that you use a lot in a lot of your writings, and I've seen it in some of your blog posts and stuff. It's called culture disjuncture. Would you define that? Because sometimes I'm like, what does that mean?
I don't know if you remember. It's not my word, actually. I wish it was. I wish I could claim it. But it was a word that came out of a book that you and I had read, I think, in 1990-ish time. This guy, he was a seminarian professor named David McKenna. And he had written this book called Mega Truth, which was kind of a spin-off of a business book that had been written in those days called Mega Trends. And very popular book. You know, all the business people were, you know, like, if you could predict the trends and see them coming, then maybe you could be the first, you know,
ahead of it.
Yeah, be ahead of it. And his book was kind of a takeoff of that thought. Like, if we could know that historically there's certain things that surround spiritual awakenings, and if you could sort of spot those things, you can actually be aware of when the awakening begins, or maybe be on the cutting edge of it. See, and so I loved that book. I always have. I know you. I had readers read it and everything, because I thought there was so much truth in it. But he used the word cultural disjuncture. And what he was talking about is that there's time. Revival never happens in good times, you know, historically. When everybody's comfortable, they don't see their need for God, and you know, and so they're just not hungry. The hunger's not there. But when there's cultural disjuncture, and he said cultural disjuncture happens in a time of parentheses, that is between two eras. Like in his case, he was saying there's coming this, and it wasn't here yet, but it was coming between the Industrial Revolution and the Age of Information. And it was just the birthing and the beginning of the Age of Information. And he said what happens is these new lights, he called them, which is generally college-age students, if they're in college or not, they're searching in the midst of that for answers, for the disjuncture that's in their culture and the discomfort that they feel with an unsure and uncertain future, not knowing where this is all going to go. There's a lot of worry. And back in the 60s, as we birthed the Jesus movement, and we were all worried about the environment, because we saw the world population just increasing rapidly at that time. It had already doubled in our lifetime. And what that would mean to us is, I mean, it had nothing to do with our Christianity. It just was what was in people's hearts and minds, you know. And but McKenna said that that's the time that the Spirit can move on a new emerging generation, and begin be really the spark of a revival. Yeah. And I always believed that. You know. So
what do you think then sparks that new revival? I mean, can you make, you know, revival happen? Can you push it along?
Yeah.
Let's get going. Come on.
I said, it's like, you know, revival is like it's a spontaneous spark of the Spirit in a generation. And I always liken it like this whole idea of synergy, of this big snowball rolling down a hill and getting bigger, going faster, you know, attracting more snow, you know, as it goes until it becomes an avalanche. And I said, you know, the object is when that snowball starts rolling, for a leader, for a Christian leader who's really hungering for this, is to get out ahead of it with a chainsaw, you know, and cut down trees and obstacles, things that would break it up when it was new. Right. And
so what do you think are the things that are hindering, or that we need to be doing to, you know, clear the way?
Well, you know, honestly, what do you think? Ruben, I think it's what we're doing. I mean, I think you and I are trying to participate with this fresh thing God's about to do. And I believe he is, and that's by warning people that it's time to get back, to journey back to the foundations of our faith, and the reality, the true reality, though, of the Spirit of God, you know, not some mustered up thing, but the real thing, you know, the timing of God, and the presence of God, and be able to see it. And I think that there's so much clutter right now in our society, and so many things that people are so fearful of that they're not seeing it. And a lot of them, even if they did, would push back on it, because I believe it's coming. And as I did in chapter 3 of my book, you know, I believe that it's coming, and I believe that it's coming in this new generation.
And why do you think people would push back on it? I mean, who's going to push back on the move of the Lord? I mean,
I would probably. I'm an old geezer, but and see,
because you don't recognize it.
Well, yeah, no, because like I've been raised in this evangelical thing, like, and it's pretty defined. Yeah, and actually, over the course of time, has become pretty legalistic in many ways.
Gotcha.
And there's only one way. It's my way or the highway. You know, I have this story I tell there in this book about my granddaughter, who's a classic millennial. Her name's Hope.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody knows Hope. Yeah. Like, you don't mess with Hope. You know, she's, one of a kind, but she's actually not. She's actually very representative, I think, of her culture. And, Hope had just turned like 16, 17. Nancy and I had an old car. We just bought a new car, so we decided instead of trade in the old car, it was Subaru, we'd give it to Hope for her 16th, 17th birthday. So we did. Well, that was a car that I had driven for years, and it was in the church parking lot every day. Well, all of a sudden, Hope was sort of working for me. It was the summer, and she was kind of part-time, kind of helping me on some mission stuff I was doing. And by the way, I got to say, Hope went off to the mission field. She went off to discipleship training school. She's a passionate Christian. Yeah. But she is definitely not someone that's going to fit in the old wineskin, you know. And so one day she comes to work, and I just happened to walk by my old car, and there's a bumper sticker on this car. And it had all the symbols of all the different, what do you call that?
It says coexist.
Oh, yeah. And it's all the symbols of all the different religions. And
I know one time,
go ahead.
I know one time Carrie and I pulled up to church and we saw that, and I knew that was your car. And I just thought,
and that's what I knew. I knew everybody knew that was my car, you know, and so I totally flipped out. I just because in my mind, that bumper sticker made the statement that there's many ways to God, you know. Right. And, you know, and I've been preaching the gospel for so many years. There's one way to God through Jesus Christ, period, you know. And so all of a sudden, I literally had a panic attack, you know, when I saw it. So I go in and she's in there.
We just rolled our eyes. We were just like.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people did more than that. And so I pulled Hope in my office, and I just was hard on her. You know, I just said, you can't do that. And she started crying, you know. And I realized, okay, what do you know, what is this? And she goes, Grandpa, she goes, that's not what that means to me and to my friends. That just means that the world needs to get along. She goes, I think that's what Jesus would want, you know. And it just hit me then. It took me more than a day. Sure. I mean, I really had to take it back to the Lord. And so, but it hit me after a course of time, like, if I am going to be a part of the new thing that God's about to birth, I've got to understand the mindset that my parents didn't understand about me. I mean, I remember bringing my parents to the Lancaster Vineyard years and years ago when Nancy and I were in our young 20s, you know, and they didn't get it and didn't like it, you know. It was just wrong. I remember of all days, you know, we were sitting around these tables and we were doing worship. It looked like some young girl looked like Joan Baez sitting on a stool, you know, leading worship. And the guy right before me had a big hole in the seat of his pants and his underwear were hanging out, you know. And we had already gotten used to that, but man, I know. That was not Christianity to my parents, you see.
I know. I'd bring my dad to church and you know, he was like Catholic through and through. And I'm like, please just not let it be weird. And no matter what, it was weird. Yeah. Every time it would be the weirdest thing would happen. And it'd be just like, oh.
And now it's us, you know.
Yeah, right.
And so I just want to remind myself of this, that I've got to understand the heart of the millennials if I'm going to have any part with what I believe is going to come. But I'll tell
why do you say millennials? Why do you say millennials?
I just say it because it says to me, it doesn't. I don't know the age group. You know, I'm not being legalistic about where that lies, but I'm probably 18 to 40s. Even my kids, though, who are in their 40s, are already looking for a different wineskin.
So that's what I'm asking. You know, what are you seeing in the millennials and younger people that's starting to get you to feel like they're just not? I mean, I guess the story was a great example of that, but is there more there? What are you seeing in young people?
The millennials are looking, because I've spent lots of time in prayer over this issue, because I want to be a champion of a new move of God. And I think the conditions in the culture in the world are right. And I just feel prophetically, I don't know how else to say it. And if you read Reform, you know that a lot of that's prophetic look at what I see coming. But but it's based not just on kind of my prophetic understandings. It's based on church history and guys like David McKenna, who wrote and warned us and gave us some kind of a grid to see it all in. But I just think the conditions are so right. And I already see this kind of generation that's floundering. And then all of a sudden we get 2020 come along and church is literally shut down. Yeah. Now that's not to me an accident. That's me a call to a new wineskin. And what I see in the old system, and it's historically true, what they try to do it's in that same story analogy that Jesus makes. He not only talks about new wine in wineskins, but he also talks about a garment, a new patch on an old garment not working. And I see a lot of patchwork. People going, okay, we got to change things up and do this and do that. But the reality is God's birthing something altogether, a complete new wine, as it's happened historically. Yeah. And so the question I ask myself is, what would it look like? And my answer comes from historical, look at things, understanding how church works. Almost 40 years of experience now, but also with biblical truth. That's why I journey back, get back to the actual core commission of Jesus. And thirdly, just being aware, of seeing what's going on in that generation and in the church, and saying, what would it look like if people like Hope, my granddaughter, would gravitate toward church? What would it look like? And I said it's they're going to be communities of truth in the book. I use truth as a acronym.
Yeah, an acronym.
Yeah, and the T was for trust. The whole thing's based around truth. Truth is going to be huge to them, and we've already discussed that issue in our first podcast. But the T here is trust, which means it has to be safe, it has to be acceptable, everybody's welcome, And we have, even in our generation, even though we thought we were real open, they're going to be way more open to who comes, and less judgmental. It has to be R is for relevance, that it has to be relevant, honest and authentic. U, as I said, was for unconditional love, but a high acceptance with less judgment, way less judgment than we've had. T was for tenacity, which is going to be, they're going to be tenacious because there's going to rise out of it, as there always is, passion. And it's going to be passion driven. H is for hope. And that is because there's got to be this light in the midst of a real dark time. Yeah. And so hope is going to be key. It's going to have to be a proclamation of hope, by people that really understand the heart of God, because that's where the hope is. And S, because I said I made the acronym plural, truths, and that is, S was for supernatural. I think when I say supernatural, though, I mean authentically supernatural. And I think that's a topic for another podcast, but I don't mean charismania.
Right. No,
yeah. Like that. And we can talk about that later. But the other thing, I don't know how our time's going here.
We're good.
Okay.
Yeah. A few minutes left.
Okay. I had this experience when I was letting go of the Boise Vineyard and handing it off to Trevor Estes, who was going to take my place, who was my kids' generation. And I handed it off for these very reasons. I didn't want it growing old with me. And I started looking in the church. And I love people with gray hair. That's no problem. My wife has gray hair,
And you do too.
And I do too. It's not that.
Me too.
I wanted the youthfulness in the church, and I didn't want to be the thing that would impede that. And so I decided purposefully to hand it down a generation. And so Trevor and I decided to start teach towards the end of the transition. He and I would team teach, and he picked the book of Joshua. You know, and I said, "You mean the book where Moses is dead on the hill and all the young people go across?" Because I knew who I was.
We're leaving you behind.
I knew who I was.
We're leaving you behind.
Anyway, we were taking turns, and I got this one passage right before the Israelites crossed over the Jordan River into the land of promise, the place of promise, and the new place. And I was going to teach this one passage. I think it was like in the 3rd chapter, and it says, and they camped in Shittim.
I remember you had a hard time with that word.
They were crossing the Jordan the next day into Gilgal. And see, you got to remember, me, I'm kind of dyslexic and stuff like that, and I'm really bad with Hebrew words. And so I was all worried about this word. It's like maybe I'm saying this wrong because I'm,
You're hoping you're saying it wrong. But please don't make me say that from the pulpit.
And so I go and research the word, and I find out understand what's in my heart at this point. I'm talking about a new generation taking the torch, right, into this whole new place of promise. And it says that they're going to go from Shittim to Gilgal, So I go do a word search on Shittim. There's only one other place in the Bible that you can see the word, and it was in Micah. Micah 6:8 is pretty popular passage, but it said in verse 5, it said, "Remember your journey from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord." In other words, another translation says, "What did you learn on your journey from Shittim to Gilgal?" Well, it goes through. It says that they didn't learn, what shall I do before the Lord? Shall I bow down before him and exalt God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000? And the answer is no. That's not what the Lord wants. He doesn't want really our sacrifices that are just to try to earn our way to heaven, right? But then the famous passage of Micah is Micah 6:8. "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." And all of a sudden I had this burst of the Spirit hit me and said, this will be the lesson that will take this generation into this whole new place of awakening. And it's going to be compassion, justice, and mercy, and humility, and authenticity.
And it's interesting what's I think fascinating is that's really the heartbeat of young people today.
It is.
A lot of, believers and unbelievers alike, they're really, really focused in on that. And, I think that for a lot of the church, that might appear to be, liberal, for lack of a better word.
But through the lenses of the church today, anything that smacks of, for example, social justice, is a liberal concept. Yeah. Well, that's why the old order is going to push against the new thing, because they're going to look at it and they're going to say, if they're caring about the poor, if they're caring about immigration and immigrants, if they're caring, about environmental issues, which there is this issue of environmental justice, and in their mind that if you want to talk about the sanctity of life, you've got to talk about climate change because it's taking down humanity ultimately.
And I think that's where I think the traditional church is really going to struggle in connecting with what's really at the heart of God without the lens of politics. And that's what's been a challenge, because the church has pegged some kind of political party to every one of these issues as if one party owns that issue. Yeah. And we have got to get free of that and say, no, God owns the issue. And the church really should own these issues, not politics or political parties.
And even as I say it right here, I can almost feel the hair rising on the backs and the necks of people. Like, what's he saying? And it's like, I think you and I need to talk about this in another time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Because I think it's too big of a subject, what this actually could look like and would look like, and why the old order will push back on the new order. So, but it's a big subject, it's a big topic. And I just want to say this. I believe with all my heart that God's about to birth a great thing. And I, for one, don't want to miss it. And I don't want my prejudices and my religiosity to get in my way. So,
well, thank you for that. That was a great discussion. As always, I love these conversations. They're challenging for me, and I think they're challenging for a lot of the people that are tuning in. And if you're tuning in and you've made it to the end of our longer conversation today, we wanted to invite you to listen again, tune into these podcasts regularly. Also, we wanted to make available Try's book, Reform. And so anybody who participates on patreon.com through our Patreon page at any level, we'd love to send you a copy of the book just for a thank you for participating with us. And so as we close, I just wanted to, let's go back into a meditative mode and think really what is at the heart of God for the world. And aside from all of our preconceived ideas, our religiosity, maybe our politics, let's focus back in on what really is at the heartbeat of God for us and for this coming revolution per se. So we hope to see it. So as we close, we just ask that you get into a reflective mode, consider this passage that we're going to have read out here, and think about how you could become part of that in your own life, and think about your own issues that may have gotten away and reconnect again with, God's true, authentic heart. Again, thank you, everyone. And thanks again, Try, and we'll see you next time.
Sitting on the Mount of Olives, Jesus spoke to his disciples in Matthew 25, saying, "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Funding for the Journey Back is made possible by viewers like you. Please visit patreon.com/thejourneyback to learn more about supporting this podcast.